The wind swept across the wide Montana plains, carrying with it the dry scent of hay, horse sweat, and the faint whisper of winter's approach, and at the heart of it all rode a man who had become both legend and enigma in the county, a cowboy named Jace Callahan, tall, broad-shouldered, and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who could rope a steer with one hand while keeping the reins steady with the other, the kind of man who fixed fences, broke broncs, and stood tall in a bar fight without ever needing to say much, but the same man who had, for reasons nobody fully understood, refused every woman who ever cast her gaze his way, and in a county where women, widows, daughters, and fiery schoolmarms were as eager to be courted as men were to build their futures, Jace's refusal to take a wife had become the stuff of gossip, concern, and even frustration, for neighbors whispered that he was too proud, too wounded from a past nobody dared to ask about, and too stubborn to admit a man couldn't face every winter alone without it gnawing at his soul. And so the county's womenfolk, from the ranchers' daughters with ribbons in their hair to the saloon girls with perfume thick as smoke, had all tried their hand at winning Jace, only to be met with that cool stare, polite smile, and slow tip of the hat that said, without words, "No, ma'am, not today, not ever," until his reputation was sealed, and mothers told their daughters not to waste their time on the cowboy who belonged only to the land and the saddle. But little did they know that Jace's refusals were not born out of arrogance, but out of a scar he carried deep, one that tied him to a promise made long ago. And though the land stretched wide and the mountains stood tall, even a cowboy like Jace could not outrun the past forever, nor could he outride the winter coming down on him faster than he expected. And in that winter his life would cross with hers, the one woman bold enough to ask him not with a flutter of lashes or a ribbon in her bonnet, but with a sharp-edged question that cut to the bone. "You want a wife, or just a winter alone?" And it was in that moment, and all the fire leading up to it, that his world began to change, though he didn't yet know it on that long autumn day as he rode back from the cattle drive with fading sun painting the sky in streaks of gold and blood. The first snow of winter had already dusted the tops of the mountains when Jace Callahan found himself staring across the yard at the woman who had upended every notion he carried about solitude, a woman named Clara Weston, who had arrived in the county with nothing but a trunk, a scar across her heart that she never spoke of, and eyes sharp enough to cut through any man's silence. And though Jace had tried to brush her off the way he had every other woman, Clara was not the sort to be brushed off, for she carried herself with grit of someone who had weathered storms harsher than Montana's winters, and her voice when she asked him that piercing question, "You want a wife or just a winter alone?" had rung through him louder than a gunshot in a canyon, a question that stripped him of all excuses and left him standing bare against truths he'd buried for too long. And so as the days shortened and the nights grew colder, Jace found himself torn between the instinct to push her away and the deeper instinct, the one he didn't want to name, that pulled him toward her warmth like a man pulled toward fire on a frozen night. And in those early weeks of winter, the county watched with bated breath, neighbors curious if the untouchable cowboy had finally met the woman who would not only challenge him but change him. And the truth was, Jace didn't know himself, for Clara was unlike any woman he'd ever known. She didn't bat her lashes or bake him pies in the hope of softening him. She didn't linger by the corral, waiting for him to notice. Instead, she worked beside him when work needed doing, hauling water, mending fence, and even calming his most temperamental horse with a steady hand that impressed him more than she would ever know. And every evening when the fire crackled inside the cabin, she sat across from him, not filling the air with chatter, but letting the silence stretch between them until it was no longer a wall but a bridge. And in that quiet, Jace began to see that sometimes it wasn't words that healed a man but presence, and sometimes it wasn't romance that bound two people but respect. Forged in labor and long nights of watching snow drift against the windows, yet still, Clara was not about to let him retreat into himself without a fight, and one evening when the wind howled like wolves outside, and Jace had muttered about how he didn't need anyone, Clara fixed her gaze on him, steady as the moon, and said, "Needing someone isn't weakness, Cowboy. It's just being human." And though Jace didn't answer, her words cracked something inside him, a crack that let in light, and for the first time in years, he found himself daring to imagine a life where winter nights weren't faced alone, and that thought both terrified and thrilled him, for the past he carried was still heavy, and he knew that before he could take Clara's hand, he would have to face the shadows that haunted him. But what he didn't know was that Clara carried shadows of her own, and before the winter was through, the two of them would find that their scars were not chains, but the very thing that could bind them together, stronger than either had ever been alone. And it was in that hard, cold, beautiful winter that Jace Callahan learned the truth of Clara Weston's question, a truth that would carry them both into a future neither had dared to dream.